Let me just get the water ready, just in case. I'm going to ask you to do something at the outset which you might find a little unusual. I'm going to ask you to pay more attention to the message, to what I'm saying, than to me as the messenger. That means for those of you at the back who can't see that I spend a lot of time shining these shoes, which I promise you I shine just as my mother taught me to, because she told me that you judge a man by his shoes. I put on a suit because I had to wear something. I knew if I'd worn jeans instead, that would have said something different about me. Maybe that this guy's a little bit of a mix of something formal and something artistic together. I thought about just really dressing down to say something. Pay little attention to this until I come to it, and I promise I will tell you what that is about in a moment. Try and see through the way I phrase things, the way I put sentences together, the structure, the form that I use. My accent, even, that you've detected is from deep Mississippi or somewhere like that. And instead, try and listen through all of that to what I'm saying, and listen very carefully to the truth or the absence of truth in what I'm saying to you. As has been said, I write and compose opera. Some people call it musical theater. The critics argue about things like that. But over the course of years, people have said to me on a number of different occasions, and these are people that have seen what I've written, people who've acted in things I've written. They've described what they said were sometimes moving experiences. Some people have said they were moved even to tears. I've had one gentleman who was an actor who described in a particular scene that he was having what he said was the most visceral reaction to the thing that he was being asked to do as an actor to other cast members. I've had said to me that some people have had what they called life-changing experiences. But that's all too much to hear. It surprises me every time I hear it. I wish I was in a position every time I heard it to push back on those people, to examine what they were saying to me, to test it, to make sure that they weren't making it up. But I've never been able to do that. Of course, I've asked questions wherever possible. I've responded to people's comments when comments were posted. But one thing it did lead me to do was to begin to think about how I do what I do. What is my method? What is the technique I use? Because I was trying to make sure that there was nothing I was doing that was causing it that I shouldn't be doing. I was interested in whether it was the storytelling process or whether it was maybe the story itself that was affecting people. And when I began to prepare to present to you today, a while ago, I wanted to talk to you about the storytelling function in theater, and how I believe that if you hold up a picture that is vivid, that is true, that is clear, it almost becomes a mirror in which an audience sees something of itself. And so in a way, theatrically, you show to an audience who they are. And so sometimes people's responses are not to necessarily what you're doing on stage through music or acting or settings or scenery or costuming. It's them responding to them seeing who they themselves are through a work of art, which is wild, really, if it's true. And I wanted to say something to you about how I believe that picture presentation process can be useful in other disciplines. But the more I looked, the more I became aware of something that was just pervasive about what I was doing. I became aware more and more of what I began to identify as the techniques of rhetoric, rhetorical technique in my own presentations. And then suddenly it was as if the lights had come on. In everything I did, I remembered in law papers I'd written, I remembered back in the UK when I was an attorney for however long it was, presenting things, and that rhetoric seemed sometimes more important than the truth in particular situations. I was aware even then that if I could present a picture, and if that picture was more convincing than somebody else's picture, that picture was believed whether or not the facts were true. And that's horrible. And as I began to look elsewhere, outside my own work, I began to see the same things at work in politics. I began to see the same things at work in journalism. I recognized it in the artistic works of some others. I know that it's clearly something that is a real and unfortunate facet of the legal process. I saw it in preaching, and it concerned me. And so I began to try and understand what rhetoric was all about. And so this here, that is rotating on a slow rotate, was one of the earliest forms of rhetoric I found. It dates from about the mid-14th century BC. It is one of the Amana papers. It effectively was a diplomatic correspondence. It's not very big. It's about that high. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And it's one of many papers, and it was written in order to try and persuade one of the Egyptian pharaohs of a particular thing. So in this diplomatic paper, you find, and it's number EA153, I think, if you want to look it up, and you can see what it actually says. But you find in it that the writer was using rhetorical technique. There is parallelism. There are phrases that are repeated over and over again, all, it seems, to try and persuade the listener of something. And the weird thing I noticed about this is that the man who wrote it is no more. The society he was part of is no more. But we have evidence of the rhetoric that he, in that society, was using. Over the years, through ancient Egypt, more recently through ancient China, into the ancient Greek civilization, we hear of Aristotle's own formulation of what rhetoric was, written 2,300 years ago, maybe. And those three rhetorical proofs, the ethos, the pathos, the logos, are the things that I'm most familiar with, and you may yourself also be familiar with. And I recognize the ethos as the ethical appeal, the appeal I as a presenter make to you based on my character, who I am. I dress in a particular way to say something to you. I appeal to you with stories in order to make you maybe like me more. I might tell you a story to make you like me less, if that's the intent of my speech. But does it make what I'm saying any more true? If I'm the most persuasive person in the world, if I can convince you of anything because of my appeal based on what I've done, how well I've done it, how good my character is or I can pretend it to be, does it make what I'm saying any more true? Of course, the answer is no, it doesn't. Then, the pathos, the appeal to an audience on the basis of emotion. If I can move an audience in a particular way. And this is what I began to see in my own work. I began to realize that if I'm moving an audience to tears, is it because of something that is just an aspect of rhetoric? If I can make an audience cry, and I know what this feels like when you're writing something, and you think, if I do this, then it's going to produce this response. If I do this, if I time this way, it's going to produce this kind of response. I can make an audience hate. I can make them hate the antagonist. I can make them love or like the protagonist. I can move people through music. Music has its own techniques. Don't be surprised if you feel an emotion of elation sometimes when there's just a little key change going on. It's just something that musicians do in the way that we structure things in order to affect an audience. But not just the ethos and the pathos, but also the logos, the way that we stylistically put things together. I became aware of this in my life and in so many other things. And here's what I want you to grasp. If a society is built on the ideas pitched to that society by those skilled in the art of rhetoric, if you listen more to those of us who may be more persuasive than others, does that mean also that you don't listen to those who can't grasp or pitch to you or persuade you with those same techniques? Are their voices marginalized? Are their voices unheard? Are they the ones that we sweep away some way? Are they the ones who you hear stories of many years later who had something important to say that we just didn't listen to? And instead, we put on platforms those who are just better at it. If a society has rhetoric as its elemental building block, if rhetoric somehow engineers that society, then all is well if that society is a good one. If in that society there is love, compassion, care for one another. If we're concerned about the welfare of those who are maybe not as fortunate as we are. If instead we give things rather than try and take things. If that is what the society is, then the society built on those building blocks, elemental blocks of rhetoric, is all well and good. But if instead, in that society, you find other things, there is no love. There is instead division. There is hatred. There is marginalization. Instead of justice, there is injustice. Then we as a society have a problem. Because not only do we need to start examining the ideas that are presented to us, but we need to start examining the way in which those ideas are presented to us. Lest we, like the writer of that, find ourselves disappearing some way. That what builds the very society that we are part of is not just the ideas that this society hears, but the way in which we pitch those ideas to this society. Now, how do we do that then? Let me give you two things. Firstly, and that's a rhetorical technique, summarizing it in two things. I'm sorry, I can feel it over everything I do. If I pause for too long at a moment, that's probably, it's in me. It's in all of us, maybe. I read that there's a process of which the nurses that children were chosen for children in early years were chosen because they would begin to school that child in ways to present, because that child will then have more of a chance of this being in them, so they'd be better at life. That's ridiculous, but it's true. The first of those two things. As an audience then, pay attention. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived by how a speaker dresses, or how shiny their shoes may be, or whether their suit costs $4,000 or $40. As an audience, push back. The dialectic is as important as the rhetoric. Debate, discourse, feedback, comments, disagreement is as much a part of our society as rhetoric, but I'm afraid that sometimes, even in a situation like this, if I was to finish well within my 80 minutes and spend the rest of the time asking you questions, we might get further than if I stopped and you didn't have a chance to push back. Because then I'd hear a view that disagreed with me. I'd hear someone telling me that thing you said is flat wrong, and I could respond to it, or someone else in another part of the room might say, oh, hold on a sec, you missed this out, and if I add that to what you said, then maybe we get somewhere, because you presented to us an aspect of the picture, but the whole picture is not just what you said. Don't be flattered when a speaker makes you like them or moves you to tears or to hate. If I had an enemy and I could make you hate my enemy, I could, by doing that, make you love me more. We see that at work in the political sphere so much. And it's wrong, but it's rhetorical technique, and we fall for it. And don't be influenced either by the structure and the way in which we speak, and those who are more memorized than others. I thought about coming up here, and I don't think that Will have let me do this. I'm trying to mumble from little scraps of paper so that it appeared less well put together, that it wasn't as memorized as it might seem to be. And that if I looked like a gentleman who'd spent the night on the streets, rather than someone who's more better dressed than a person who spent the nights on the street, would you have listened to me more or less? And the second thing is, as presenters, we have an obligation to make sure that we pay attention to truth. Speak truth, by all means, because in our society, in our culture, in our lives, truth matters. What is truth? That was one of the questions I know we were asked in trying to put together a biography in an unusual way for this presentation. I could spend the rest of my time trying to persuade you what truth is. I'm not going to do that. That's another talk altogether. But what I've tried to present to you is this, is a way in which, if we look at the way in which truth is dressed up or concealed or doesn't exist at all in things that are presented to us, and we begin to strip away those elemental building blocks of rhetoric in every presentation, then we as a society and as individuals may have some chance of finding out what truth is for ourselves. Thank you.